Hey guys, how you guys doing? May the 4th be with you. May 4th. Haha. Whoa. Today we're going to be looking at the Cuban Missile Crisis and the Berlin Wall, the two biggest events of the Cold War. And once we finish this, we'll probably be moving on into the Cold War in Asia. But the Cuban Missile Crisis and the Berlin Wall are awesome. They're crazy, shows how stupid humans are. So let's jump right into this nonsense. Skipping those essential questions. Yeah. So the Cuban Missile Crisis, and there goes my phone. Of course it does. The Cuban Missile Crisis is the closest the world came to actually ending. I mean, actually ending, as in like we were so stupid we almost killed every human being on Earth. This is the Cuban Missile Crisis. It is the absolute closest we ever came to a full nuclear war, and you'll see just how close we actually came. Uh, this is cool. Look at this little map here. You see Cuba. You'll see why Cuba is important in a minute. But a couple things about Cuba you should know. Notice how it's really, really close to Florida, 90 miles away from Miami. Just keep that in mind. It will be important later. Look, it's Cuba again. So Cuba is 90 miles off the coast of Florida, and what they're going to do is Cuba's going to turn communist. Crazy, huh? Think about that. Everything we've talked about, communism is over here, in the Soviet Union. And we've been trying to contain it in Europe so that doesn't spread. And then all of a sudden, without us even noticing it, it pops up in Cuba, only 90 miles away from the United States. You can imagine we were not happy about this. We did not want communism spreading at all, and we sure as hell didn't want it 90 miles away from us. The person who makes Cuba communist is Fidel Castro, guy who just died not too long ago. We had an interesting history with Fidel Castro. When he turns Cuba communist, basically what the United States tries to do is we try to assassinate him many, many, many times, and we failed many, many, many times. In fact, this is a true story. We actually gave him an exploding cigar because he was always smoking Cuban cigars. We gave him an exploding cigar in the hopes that he would smoke it and it would explode and kill him. That's how desperate we were to get rid of communism in Cuba. But he wouldn't die. We couldn't get rid of him. Next year, you'll learn about the Bay of Pigs invasion. It's another thing that we did trying to kill Castro that failed. Here's Castro with the leader of the Soviet Union after Stalin dies, Khrushchev. And so Cuba and the Soviet Union become allies. Cuba becomes communist. And so, yeah, that's question number one for you. Who led the communist revolution in Cuba? Fidel Castro. And your second question is coming up. What did the Soviet Union ship to Cuba? Well, now that Cuba and the Soviet Union were such good BFFs, the Soviets decide to send nuclear weapons to Cuba, which is only 90 miles away from the United States. Now, they're doing this in secret. This ship is a picture of a ship going from the Soviets to Cuba, and you can't see, but there's nuclear missiles on this ship. This was crazy. If Cuba has nuclear missiles and they're only 90 miles away from us, if those missiles get fired, the United States gets about 5 minutes of warning before the missiles land. I mean, it's insane. So the Soviets give nuclear missiles to Cuba. And this is important. During the Cold War, neither side would use their nuclear missiles because of, remember what we talked about, MAD, mutually assured destruction. If one side uses their missiles, the other side's going to use their missiles, everybody dies. Oh, no fun. What the missiles in Cuba did is it gave the Soviet Union, and this is your next question, it gave the Soviet Union first strike capability, strike first capability. It gave the Soviet Union the ability to fire their missiles before we even had a chance to fire ours. If it's only a 5-minute leeway, they could fire their missiles and their missiles could land and kill us before we get to hit our button and launch our missiles. This was unacceptable. Absolutely unacceptable. And so we said, Cuba, stop. And so this picture showing you from Havana how far the missiles could reach, and it was the entire United States. And here's the kicker. We didn't even know that the Soviets did this. We had no idea. It was all done in secret. The only way we actually found out that Cuba had nuclear missiles was by accident. We were flying. This plane right here is called the U-2 spy plane. It's one of the coolest planes ever made in existence. What we were doing, we were flying these spy planes over Cuba. And in the front of the plane, in the nose cone here, there was a high-speed camera. And as we flew, the plane would just be taking pictures of everything underneath it. Thousands and thousands and thousands of pictures. No idea what it was taking pictures of. And so one of these planes flies over, takes a bunch of pictures, and what happens in the military is these pictures get looked at by what are called military intelligence analysts. And they literally go over these pictures with like a microscope, and they try to see any little detail that they could find on what's going on in Cuba. And there's this guy, he's looking at these pictures, and he goes, "Oh, look at these things, and these things over here." And a light bulb goes on. He goes, "Wait a second. Those look like just the things I saw in the Soviet Union when we looked at those pictures. Holy crap. The Soviets have nuclear missiles in Cuba." It completely discovered by accident. And so we go back and we look at all the pictures and we were like, "Oh my God, this dude's right. They have nuclear missiles in Cuba. What are we going to do about this?" At the time, the president was John F. Kennedy. You might have heard of him. This is in 1962. Uh, and so he knows that he has to do something. We cannot allow these missiles to stay in Cuba. And so what he does, he decides that he's going to blockade Cuba. He's going to use the United States Navy to make a circle of ships around Cuba. And he's going to draw lines in the water. And he tells the Soviets, if you bring another ship past our blockade, it's on like Donkey Kong. Nuclear war, here we come. We just, this isn't going to be allowed. You can see we literally put a ring of ships around Cuba. And you know how the Soviet Union is, so they're like, nah, I think we're going to go past your line because we can. At this point, both sides have nuclear weapons. And so the Soviets start sailing their ships towards Cuba. We have our ships in the water going towards them, and it's a showdown. It's a game of chicken on the ocean between the Soviet Union and the United States in the middle of the Cold War. And this got really, really dangerous, guys. I mean, insanely dangerous. Our president says we're going to sink any ship that tries to get to Cuba. We're going to blockade Cuba. We do it. This is the Washington Post article, headlines. And this is what it becomes. So you have our president Kennedy sitting on a hydrogen bomb that says Soviet Union. You have Khrushchev, the leader of the Soviet Union, sitting on a hydrogen bomb that says USA. Both leaders have their fingers on the nuclear triggers. And guys, it got so close to actually turning into a nuclear war. We can talk about stories of Soviet subs that got surrounded by US ships, and the Soviet subs' radios stopped working, so they thought there was a nuclear war, so they almost launched their nukes. We can talk about planes that got shot down that almost launched the nukes. There were so many things that went wrong here. You can actually say that we came within a minute, probably a lot closer than a minute, to actually starting a nuclear war over the missiles in Cuba. Um, the Cubans even shot down one of our spy planes, the same ones that we showed you earlier, the U-2 spy planes. The Cubans shoot one of our planes down, and it's funny because we thought, who cares what the Cubans do? We have to worry about what the Soviets are doing. Here's another thing about the Cuban Missile Crisis that we didn't know. We never knew that the Cubans had the ability to shoot the missiles. We thought only the Soviets could shoot the missiles, so we weren't worried about the Cubans. It turns out we found out a lot later that the whole time this is going on, the Cubans could have at any time shot the missiles themselves. Oops. That would have not been good. Um, how does this all end? The Cuban Missile Crisis. Basically, they get within minutes of killing each other, and then eventually the Soviet Union backs down. But your next question is, what three things did the U.S. have to promise to get the Soviets to back down? Well, let's go through them. So here they are putting the nuclear war, which is the big scary hand, back in the box because they avoided killing each other. The first thing that the U.S. has to do, they have to promise never to invade Cuba or try to kill Castro again. That's the first thing. Another thing they have to do is, this is funny, is the United States has to agree to remove missiles from Turkey. So the entire time we were complaining about the Soviets having nuclear missiles 90 miles away in Cuba, we had nuclear missiles in Turkey, which was less than 90 miles away from the Soviet Union. Let that sink in for a minute. We were telling the Soviets not to do the exact same thing that we were doing. That is the meaning of the word hypocrite. And so that's why the Soviets were like, yeah, if we have to take our missiles out of Cuba, you have to take your missiles out of Turkey. And so we do. And so that's the end of the Cuban Missile Crisis. Crisis is averted. The world doesn't end, and so we move on. That's 1962. Another thing that happens in the Cold War is the fact that once Berlin gets separated into East Berlin and West Berlin, East Berlin being Soviet, West Berlin being democracy and capitalism, what happens is a lot of the people who are stuck in East Berlin, the Soviet side, try to escape into West Berlin. The Soviets really don't like this because it makes communism look really, really bad. And so, what the leader of the Soviet Union, Khrushchev, is going to do, he's going to cut off access to West Berlin. So, what was the Soviet leader Khrushchev upset about? He's upset because the East Berliners are escaping to West Berlin. And so, he's going to do something which I'm sure you've actually heard of. He's going to build the Berlin Wall. You know how Stalin tried to blockade all of Berlin? Well, that didn't work. So what Khrushchev is going to do, he's actually going to build a wall that separates West Berlin from East Berlin. And what's sick about this, it's not a wall to keep people out, it's a wall to keep people in. Because the communists were losing all their people. They were all trying to flee, run away from it. And so he's going to build this wall in a matter of days. It's just going to pop up out of nowhere. And this is like on the first day, you see it just really small here. And then it gets bigger as they're building. And this is literally on the right-hand side, this is West Berlin. On the left side, this is East Berlin. So Soviet democracy. And then it keeps getting bigger. This wall went up so fast that people got separated from their families. If you were in the wrong section, when the wall went up, you got stuck. You were not allowed back over. And so families got separated for 30, 40 years. So this is a picture of what the Berlin Wall became. It became, honestly, like a war zone. Barbed wires lined with mines, machine gun posts. Many people were killed trying to escape from East Berlin to run to West Berlin. They were trying to escape communism and run to democracy, and they were murdered in the process. And so, your last question here? What did the Berlin Wall become? It becomes the image of the Cold War. Now, what's going to happen, and we'll get there, is that eventually this wall, the Berlin Wall, is going to be knocked down. It's going to be by hand. The people of East Berlin are going to get so sick and tired of this friggin' wall that they're going to take pickaxes and hammers and knock the thing down. But that's not going to be until 1989. So the Cold War is going to last a while. But these are the two main events of the Cold War. You have the Cuban Missile Crisis and the building of the Berlin Wall. So the Berlin Wall ends up being up to 15 feet high. It was a total length of 110 miles. It's insane. They have the death strip, and I'm going to post a video if I can find it about more about the Berlin Wall, because you really have to see it to believe it. It's kind of insane. And this is the Berlin Wall going all the way around, totally separating east from west. All right, guys, that's it for today. Hopefully you guys are all well. I miss you, and we'll see each other soon, I'm sure.